Hi everyone, welcome to Professor Long's lectures in anatomy and physiology. If you're watching these videos, you know we're in the coronavirus or COVID-19 shutdown, and these videos have all been placed on YouTube for my students to learn from. Those of you who are not from Del Mar College or enrolled in my class, you can still learn from them. This is the second video in a series of videos to introduce anatomy and physiology to my students. Please hit like and subscribe so that you get the new videos and all that good stuff. Now, if you're following along, we're going to be on page 7 of my note set in my class. We just finished page 6. We finished the introduction to the course, and I'm going to be continuing along here. On page 7, it asks you to list the levels of organization. We did that in the last video. I listed the first 7 levels of organization. By the way, there are levels of organization smaller and larger than we discussed, but they're not going to be relevant for anatomy and physiology. The next part of the note set asks you to define or give the function of each one of the 11 organ systems. You should be able to list the 11 organ systems. You know, the integumentary system, the cardiovascular system, the muscular system, the skeletal system, reproductive system, urinary system, digestive system, respiratory system. You should be able to list the 11 systems of the human body. And what I want you to do is in the note set, you open it up to the first few pages of your lecture textbook and just fill in the function here. I'm not going to go over all of those. You can do that on your own time. We're going to discuss some of the terminology at the bottom of page 7. We're going to move on to page 8. At the bottom of page 7, we're discussing what is the internal and the external environment, or the intracellular and extracellular environment. The term internal means inside of, right? And when we say intra is a prefix for something that means within, or it means inside of. They mean the same thing. So if I talk about the internal environment, I'm talking about the environment inside of something. If I'm talking about the intracellular environment, that's the environment within that cell, or the internal environment of the cell. Anytime I talk about something that's like the external environment, external means outside of. Or we'll sometimes use the term extra, which means outside. So the external environment of the cell or the extracellular environment both mean the same thing. They mean the environment outside the cell. Okay. We're also going to use this term intercellular and intracellular. And they are different. This is where language is important. Intercellular, inter means between. So the intercellular environment is the environment between the cells. The intracellular environment is the environment within the cell or inside the cell. They mean two totally different things, okay? And sometimes we'll use the term interstitial. Let me give you this fancy word here, okay? Again, inter means between, and stitial refers to tissues. So the interstitial environment, or the interstitial area, is the area between tissues. As something flows from one tissue to another, we'll talk about the interstitial fluid, the fluid that flows between tissues and things. So those definitions are on the bottom of page 7, and I just want you to understand that inter and intra are not the same thing. You have to get strong in your vocabulary in order to do well in this class. So the extracellular fluid or the interstitial fluid is really kind of the same stuff. It's the fluid outside the cells, or the fluid that flows between tissues. Now, on page 8, it's going to start going over the different regions of the body, and you should be learning all the different anatomical terms. We're not going to use these common everyday terms. We don't say neck, we say cervical or cervix. Cervicis refers to the neck region. Cephal or cephalon means head. We're going to be covering all of these terms in the laboratory. So if you're on page 8, one of the things I would do is put at the top here, done in lab. Watch the lab video, and you should learn all the different parts of the body. Okay. Now, the next part says on the facing blank page, identify the 9 abdominal pelvic regions. Again, we're going to do this in the laboratory video, and we'll cover that for the laboratory portion of this course. And then there's anatomical position. I am going to go over anatomical position because I want to reiterate what we're doing in lab. Now, for all of this page, if I were to ask you something on a lecture test, I might ask you something like, which of the following terms is the correct anatomical term for the neck? And you would have to say cervical. Or which of the following terms would be the correct anatomical term for the region of the body that we call the head? And you would put cephalon or cephalic. Again, we're going to go over all that in lab, and you need to practice it for both lecture and lab. In lab, I'll just point to the parts of the body on a model, and you have to identify it. It'll say ID the region of the body, or ID the body region. Cephalon, cervical, thoracic, abdominal. I'm going to be going over that in lab again, okay? I do want to go over the bottom of the page because I need you to understand these terms, and then you'll see how I do that in lab as well. So, the term anterior means the front, or it can mean in front of. So if you were looking at me from an anterior view, you're looking at the front of the body. Anti always means to precede or in front of. So this is an anterior view of me. The opposite of that is posterior. Posterior means back, behind, or in back of, okay? So if you were going to look at a person from a posterior view, you would be looking at the back of the body this way. Anterior, posterior. Got it? Now, because the terminology and the science of anatomy was born at a time where you couldn't really play with dead people, you couldn't cut up a dead person and understand them, or else you might get burned at the stake, called a heretic or something, then the easiest way to study it and learn was to wait till something died, go dig it up and drag it into your lab, dissect it, and then go bury it before anyone saw you. So they did a lot of stuff on animals, four-legged animals first. And so we use a couple of terms that mean the same thing in human anatomy and physiology as anterior and posterior, okay? So one of the things that we talk about for posterior is we also use the term dorsal. Dorsal means the back or behind, like the dorsal fin on a dolphin or a shark. And another term that means the front or in front of in anatomy and physiology is ventral. Ventral really means the belly side. But because we stand upright, our anterior surface is also our ventral surface. On a dog or a cat or a horse, you don't have anterior and posterior. You simply have ventral and dorsal. Okay? So anterior or ventral, posterior or dorsal. Okay? Now, they mean the same thing, front or back. The next two terms that we can discuss are going to be this. Okay? We're going to use the terms superior and inferior. Superior means above or on top of. And inferior means the exact opposite. It means below, or it can mean under something else. For example, if I was going to talk about the thoracic region, the chest, and the abdominal region, I could say that the thorax is superior to the abdomen. Or I could say the abdomen is inferior to the thorax. These are called directional terms, or they're also called relative position, because they tell you the position of one structure relative to another, or they could tell you which direction to move on the body. So if I said I want you to start at the umbilicus, which is your belly button, and move in the superior direction about 4 centimeters, then you would know to go in this direction, move up from the belly button. That's how the instructions are written for certain surgeries. If you become a surgical tech, it'll say the doctor prefers his patient in this position, and they'll begin with an incision starting at this part of the body, moving in a superior direction, approximately 4 centimeters, and you'll know what all that means. Now, again, because we stand upright, we sometimes use the term cephalic. So to move in a superior direction in human anatomy also means to move in a cephalic direction, meaning moving towards the head. So sometimes we'll use the term cephalic for superior, but very rarely. We're really going to rely on superior and inferior, but you'll still see these terms sometimes. Cauda means tail. So to move in a caudal direction, That means you're going to move towards the tailbone or towards the tail of the body. Again, in clinical terminology, we'll use superior and inferior. But technically, we can also use cephalic and caudal. I don't like those terms a lot for human anatomy and physiology. So, know those terms, superior and inferior. Two other terms that are related to each other that you need to learn are medial and lateral. Medial means closer to the midline of the body, or whatever it is that we're studying. Means closer to the midline. Lateral means farther from the midline. Or I like to think of lateral as off to the side, or the one side or the other. For example, if I drew a line right down the middle of my body, okay, let's say I have a little person standing here. Here's the eyes, the nose, the mouth, the head. This person's a mutant, okay? It's just a quick sketch though. If I drew a line right down the middle of the body, right down the midline, and I have two structures, A and B, I could say that A is medial to B, or B is lateral to A. A is closer to the midline of the body, B is farther from the midline. Now, one of the things we are going to talk about, and I haven't mentioned yet, and I need to, is correct anatomical position. Correct anatomical position would be someone standing upright, their feet together, their hands at their sides, with the palms facing forward. We call this correct anatomical position or anatomical position. You should know that term. Anatomical position is someone standing upright, feet together, palms forward. When we use this terminology, you always imagine someone back in correct anatomical position. So if you were an EMT or a paramedic and you were at the scene and someone was all mangled and twisted in an accident and you were trying to get information to somebody, you would have to use this terminology and the other person would picture them this way. You could say this person has a laceration to the inferior brachium. Well, you're going to learn the brachium is the upper arm. Inferior would be down here, or they would say distal brachium, and it would be, an incision, or it would be a laceration or cut approximately so many centimeters, blah, blah, blah. They would use all this anatomical terminology. You always picture someone this way. Now, the reason I mention that now is because if your palms are facing forward, the little finger is the most medial on your hand, your thumb is the most lateral. So if I were asked a question on a test that says, the ring finger is blank to the index finger, then your ring finger would be medial to the index finger because it's closer to the midline. Or this is the medial surface of the elbow, the lateral surface of my elbow. Whatever's closer to midline is medial. I always think of medial is closer to the middle, and lateral is off to one side. Okay. So now we know anterior front, posterior back, superior above, inferior below, and we have medial and lateral. Now the next two I'm going to throw at you tend to confuse people a lot. So please be careful, please pay attention, and please understand this. When I use the terms distal and proximal, okay? Let me make sure this appears on the screen. Sometimes I write a little too high on the board. Boy, I'm right at the edge of my camera. So proximal means closer to the point of attachment. And distal means farther from the point of attachment. And we're talking about on limbs. Your four limbs, your arms and your legs. Now technically, we could use either superior or proximal and inferior or distal. For example, if I was going to look at somebody's arm, let me draw another person here, okay? So if I have someone's head and their hand, again, I'm drawing some people that grew up next to nuclear plants, so they're mutants, but there's the thumb sticking out, okay? Correct anatomical position. Now, I could say, if I put the letter A here and the letter B here, I could say that A is superior to B because I'm talking about the whole body. if I put the letter C here, technically I could say A is superior to C, but I would have to say relative to the vertical plane. I could also say that A is proximal to C because the point of attachment of the joint is right here. And since A is closer to the point of attachment and C is farther from that point of attachment, then A would be proximal, C would be distal. So when we use the terms, they're not really interchangeable with superior and inferior. I know this is confusing, so pay attention. If I'm talking about the entire body, especially in a clinical situation, you will use the terms superior and inferior. If I'm talking about a single limb, like your left arm or your right arm, we would use the terms proximal and distal. If you were in surgery, the doctor will never say, hey, relative to the vertical plane, move the x-ray machine in the superior direction. If they're taking an x-ray of the arm, they're going to say, hey, more proximal, move it more proximal. Okay, too far, go a little more distal. Okay, right there. Now give me an x-ray. They'll use that terminology in a clinical situation when we're talking about a single limb. The same thing for your leg. So if I had the letters B and D here, since this is the point of attachment at the hip, B is proximal to D, D is distal to B. We don't use superior and inferior when we're talking about a single limb. Got it? Excuse me. So, proximal, distal. If you speak Spanish, you know proxima and distante, you use the same terms. Proximal, distal. If I was looking down my leg, closer to me, in close proximity, or distant. Make sense? We only use superior and inferior if we're talking about the whole body. We use proximal and distal when we're talking about a limb. Now, I think I have 2 more to do, and then we're done with this little section, and that would be superficial and deep. Superficial means very close to the surface of the body, and deep means farther from the surface of the body, or it means deep, I guess. If we were looking at a swimming pool, and something's floating on the surface, and the drain is down here, I would say this is superficial, and this is deep. Superficial means shallow, is kind of what it means. If you had a cut or a wound on your arm, if it's a superficial wound, then you just cut your skin. If it's a deep wound, you might see muscle and bone. So superficial means close to the surface of the body. Deep means deep or down below the surface. So we're going to use all of these terms interchangeably sometimes and strung together to understand the human body. And you need to know where something is. For example, my ears would be lateral to my nose. My nose would be medial to my ears. My nose is superior to the mouth is inferior to the nose. Or I could say the elbow is proximal compared to the wrist because it's closer to the point of attachment than the wrist is. The wrist would be distal to the elbow. My nose is on the anterior margin of my head, and I lack hair on the posterior margin and the superficial margin and the lateral margins of my head. Anyway, you can start to use these terms, practice them, and make sure you understand them, run through the textbook, okay? So now, we're done with page 8. On page 9, there's a little exercise here for you to fill in using all this terminology to practice. And we can talk about a lateral view representing the ventral and dorsal body cavities. We're going to do that in lab. And we're going to talk a little bit about the organs found in those areas in the laboratory. So we're going to be done with chapter 1 of the lecture textbook. I hope that this brief, not so brief sometimes, I'm a little verbose early on because I know students are scared and nervous. I could be running through this terminology and cover 20 pages in 5 minutes, but I don't want to sound like an auctioneer. I want you to understand the material and get comfortable so that we can all take off running once we get to the next point. Thanks for watching. I hope you learned something. I hope you had as much fun as I did, and I'll see you in the next video, in video 3 for the first module of AMP1. Thanks, folks.